ladies and gentlemen, before we dive into today's conversation, I want you to take a second and ask yourself, how many times have I overanalyzed something that was already over? Maybe it was a conversation, a mistake. What if that never even happened? And yet, your mind wouldn't let go. If that sounds familiar, then this message is for you. Because today, we're not just talking about overthinking. We're going deeper into the reason why your brain loves overthinking, even when it hurts you. This isn't just about mental habits. It's about your brain's wiring and how it was built to protect you, but sometimes ends up trapping you. Now let's begin. Ladies and gentlemen, your brain is a magnificent machine. It's been evolving for millions of years, designed not for happiness or peace, but for one thing, survival. From the earliest days of human existence, our ancestors lived in environments full of danger, wild animals, unpredictable weather, and constant threats. And the brain learned one very powerful skill, anticipation. If you could anticipate a threat, you could avoid it. If you could analyze every situation in advance, you could stay alive. Fast forward to today, there are no lions hiding in the bushes of your office or tigers stalking you in a classroom. And yet, your brain still functions as if danger is just around the corner. That's where overthinking begins. It's not a flaw. It's not a weakness. It's the brain doing what it was trained to do, protect you by predicting every possible outcome. When your mind replays a conversation over and over, it's trying to analyze for danger. Did I say something wrong? Did they judge me? What if I made a mistake? When you lie in bed at night imagining every worst-case scenario, your brain is scanning for what could go wrong, so you can avoid being caught off guard. This is called hypervigilance, and it's deeply rooted in the survival center of the brain, especially the amygdala, which processes fear and threat. You see, the brain doesn't care if you're happy. It only cares if you're safe. And sometimes safety feels like control. So the brain tries to think of everything that could go wrong, everything that already went wrong, and everything that might be wrong, just to stay one step ahead. But the price of this protection? Exhaustion, mental paralysis, anxiety, sleepless nights. You start drowning in thoughts that were only meant to keep you afloat. That's the paradox. Overthinking was designed to save us, but in modern life, it often suffocates us. Let me give you an example. Imagine a person walking through a forest thousands of years ago. They hear a rustle in the bushes. Their brain instantly floods with thoughts. Is it a snake? A predator? Should I run? Climb? Stay still? That rapid thinking may have saved their life. But now, in 2025, you hear a text tone, and your brain reacts the same way. Why didn't they reply? Are they angry? Did I say something wrong? What if they never speak to me again? The threat isn't physical anymore, it's emotional. But your brain doesn't know the difference. To the brain, rejection, embarrassment, uncertainty all feel just as dangerous as a tiger once did. So it sends you into survival mode, into mental overdrive, hoping to think your way to safety. And once that loop begins, it becomes addictive. Because even though overthinking feels uncomfortable, it also feels familiar. It feels like control. Ladies and gentlemen, overthinking is not your enemy. It's a sign that your brain is trying to care for you. It's trying to prepare you. But sometimes that protective instinct gets turned up too loud. The key isn't to hate your brain for overthinking. The key is to understand it. Because when you understand that overthinking is rooted in a desire to protect, you can begin to respond not with frustration, but with compassion. So the next time your mind spirals with thoughts you can't control, take a breath and say to yourself, this is just my brain trying to keep me safe. But I'm okay. I'm not in danger. I'm not in the jungle. I don't need to figure everything out right now. Because awareness, not war, is a first step toward peace. Overthinking isn't just a bad habit. It's often a side effect of how the brain processes uncertainty. Human beings are not wired to sit comfortably with the unknown. When we don't have answers, our mind rushes in to fill the gaps, even if it means creating worst-case scenarios that haven't happened and probably never will. And this response isn't accidental. It's actually tied to a part of the brain known as the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for higher-order thinking, decision-making, problem-solving, and planning. It's a powerful part of our cognitive system, but it has a downside when faced with uncertainty, like not knowing how someone feels about you or not knowing what will happen at tomorrow's meeting. This part of the brain tries to gain control by running through every possibility again and again. But the more it does this, the more it strengthens a loop. Uncertainty, thinking, temporary relief, more uncertainty, even more thinking. This is called the cognitive loop of anticipation. The brain tricks you into believing that by overthinking, you're solving the problem. But in most emotional situations, there's no clear solution. There's only time, patience, and presence. So instead of finding clarity, you end up even more confused, even more anxious, and mentally stuck. This is where psychology introduces a concept of intolerance of uncertainty, a psychological trait where some individuals find it extremely hard to deal with ambiguity. People who struggle with this often try to control situations by predicting every outcome. But in doing so, they overload their brain with hypothetical scenarios, which creates more anxiety, not less. What makes this worse is that the brain starts to associate overthinking with doing something. It gives a false sense of productivity. You feel like you're being responsible, staying ahead, being prepared, trying not to make mistakes. But that sense of control is only temporary. Because no matter how many times you replay that conversation or plan that scenario, life can still go in a completely different direction. Control is an illusion, but the brain doesn't like that idea. So it keeps working harder, going in circles. Let's take an example. Imagine someone waiting for a job interview result. The logical thing would be to wait, maybe check in once, and distract yourself in the meantime. But if you're someone with a low tolerance for uncertainty, your brain doesn't rest. It starts creating stories. Maybe they didn't like my tone. What if they found someone better? What if I answered that one question wrong? You begin rewriting the entire interview in your head, trying to fix something that's already over. That's the core issue. Overthinking is always focused either on the past, which you cannot change, or the future, which you cannot control. It avoids the present moment completely, and yet it's in the present where all real decisions, peace, and power lie. Now, from a psychological standpoint, overthinking is also linked with high levels of neuroticism, one of the big 5 personality traits. People with high neuroticism are more prone to anxiety, emotional reactivity, and deep self-reflection. They often live with an inner dialogue that never turns off. This doesn't mean there's something wrong with them. It simply means their brain is wired to process deeply. But when left unchecked, this depth turns inward and becomes self-destructive. So what's the solution? The first step is awareness. Noticing when your mind is spiraling. Catching the moment when thinking stops being useful and becomes obsessive. The second step is grounding. Learning how to come back to the present moment, either through mindfulness techniques, breath work, or simply interrupting the loop with action. Sometimes, the best way to stop overthinking is not to think less, but to do something neutral, like standing up, changing your environment, or even speaking your thoughts out loud to someone else. Because once you name it, I'm overthinking because I feel uncertain, you take back some power from the cycle. You give your mind something solid to hold on to, instead of letting it drift endlessly in imagined outcomes. The truth is, overthinking comes from a good place. The desire to be safe, to be right, to avoid mistakes. But the very attempt to avoid discomfort creates more of it. And that's the irony. The more we resist uncertainty, the more power it gains over us. When you start to accept that life is full of things you'll never fully know, that peace doesn't come from figuring everything out. It comes from being okay without figuring it out. That's when the grip of overthinking begins to loosen. When we talk about overthinking, we often assume it's just a mental habit. But what many people don't realize is that overthinking has a strong emotional component. It's not just about thoughts. It's about how those thoughts make us feel and how those feelings keep the thoughts alive. And one of the most powerful emotional fuels for overthinking is anxiety. Anxiety is the emotional signal your brain sends when it senses a threat, real or imagined. In ancient times, this was incredibly useful. If you were hunting or being hunted, your brain needed to stay alert, analyze every sound, every movement, and prepare for action. But today, the threats aren't lions or wild animals. They're texts left on read, job interviews, or wondering whether someone likes you back. The brain hasn't evolved much, but the environment has changed drastically. So that same protective system starts working overtime on things that aren't life-threatening, but feel emotionally dangerous. Now here's where the trap begins. You experience anxiety, maybe because you're uncertain, worried, or insecure. That anxiety triggers a thought. Then that thought leads to another one. And before you know it, your mind is running simulations. You begin imagining conversations that never happened, outcomes that haven't occurred, and decisions you can't undo. It starts with one worry, and suddenly, you've written a full-blown script of your own failure or heartbreak. Why? Because your brain is trying to find relief. It's saying, let me think this through enough so I can feel better. But instead of relief, it finds more fear. This cycle of thought feeding emotion, and emotion feeding thought is called a feedback loop, and it's incredibly powerful. Imagine anxiety as a fire and overthinking as the oxygen. The more thoughts you add, the more intense the fire becomes. And the stronger the emotion, the harder it is to stop thinking. The loop becomes self-sustaining. You think because you feel anxious, and you feel anxious because you think too much. One of the common psychological patterns behind this is called emotional reasoning. That means you start believing your thoughts simply because you feel bad. For example, if you feel insecure, you assume you must have done something wrong. If you feel nervous, you assume something bad is about to happen. So instead of observing your emotions, you trust them as facts. And your thoughts follow that emotion, building an entire narrative around it, even if it's not based on any real evidence. This is why emotional regulation is such a key part of managing overthinking. When you're able to slow down, calm your nervous system, and create a sense of internal safety, your thoughts begin to shift automatically. You don't have to force yourself to think positively. You just need to interrupt the emotional fuel that's keeping the overthinking engine running. Sometimes, it's as simple as naming what you're feeling. Saying to yourself, this is anxiety, or this is fear, can help the logical part of your brain re-engage. Neuroscience shows that labeling an emotion reduces its intensity, a process known as affect labeling. Because once you recognize the emotion, it stops being this vague cloud and becomes something you can work with. You begin to see that it's not the world falling apart. It's just your brain reacting to discomfort. And let's be honest, many of us were never taught how to feel our feelings. We were taught how to explain them, hide them, solve them, or escape them, but not how to sit with them. So what do we do instead? We overthink. We try to fix something mentally that actually needs emotional attention. We ask, what's wrong with me? When the better question would be, what am I feeling right now and what do I need? The truth is, overthinking is often a symptom, not the root problem. The root is emotional discomfort. And until we learn to regulate that discomfort, the thoughts will keep spinning. But there's hope in that realization, because you don't have to control every thought. You just need to take care of the emotion beneath it. Sometimes the most powerful way to calm the mind is to simply be kind to the heart. The way our brains are wired has a deep connection to our tendency to overthink. One of the most critical things to understand is that the brain is not designed for happiness or peace. It is designed for survival. And survival often means scanning for danger, predicting what could go wrong, and mentally rehearsing possible outcomes. This is where the default mode network comes in. The default mode network, or DMN, is a group of interconnected brain regions that become active when we're not focused on the outside world, when our minds wander. It's during these moments, like when we're alone, lying in bed, or sitting silently, that the brain defaults to internal thoughts. And unfortunately, this default mode is not neutral. It tends to focus on the past or the future, often in a negative way. The mind drifts toward regrets, anxieties, unresolved problems, and imagined scenarios. That's why overthinking often creeps in during quiet moments. The brain, left unstimulated, starts searching for something to fix, something to fear, or something to figure out. But why does it lean toward the negative? Because from an evolutionary perspective, it was much safer to assume the worst and be wrong than to assume everything was fine and be caught off guard. Our ancestors who were hyper-alert to threats were more likely to survive. That tendency still exists in us today, even though the threats we face are now emotional, social, or psychological. not physical. So when your brain replays a conversation, imagines worst-case scenarios, or fixates on what someone might be thinking about you, it's actually trying to protect you. It's saying, if I can anticipate the pain, maybe I can prevent it. But ironically, this protective mechanism ends up creating more distress than it prevents. Neuroscience also tells us that our brain creates patterns based on repetition. So if you overthink regularly, you're literally strengthening those neural pathways. The brain becomes better at overthinking. It becomes your default setting. Like a muscle being trained over time, those thought loops grow stronger the more you use them. That's why it feels so hard to stop. It's not just a habit. It's a biological pathway that's been reinforced again and again. This is also why overthinking often feels compulsive. You might logically know that thinking about something won't solve it, or that worrying won't change the outcome. But the brain craves completion, certainty, and closure. And when it doesn't get it, it keeps looping the same thought, hoping that eventually it will find an answer or make the discomfort go away. But the answer rarely comes, because what the brain is really seeking is emotional resolution, not intellectual solutions. Another key part of this wiring is our brain's relationship with control. The human brain wants to feel in control, especially in uncertain or stressful situations. Overthinking gives a false sense of control. It feels like if you just think hard enough, you'll find the right answer, make the right choice, or avoid making a mistake. But often, all it does is keep you stuck in indecision and fear. That's why mindfulness and self-awareness are so powerful. They help quiet the default mode network and shift the brain into a state of presence. When you focus on your breath, on your body, or on a sensory experience, you're training your brain to be here, now, instead of jumping to what was or what could be. And over time, this rewires your brain toward calm rather than chaos. So when you find yourself overthinking, remember, your brain is not broken. It's simply doing what it was designed to do, keep you safe. The challenge is to update that programming, to train your brain that it doesn't need to solve every problem in advance. That uncertainty is not danger. That discomfort is not always a sign of risk. Understanding this biological wiring doesn't make overthinking disappear overnight, but it does give you the power to respond differently. You can start to interrupt the loops. You can stop treating every thought as truth. You can bring your awareness back to the moment, knowing that your mind is a tool, not a tyrant. And that shift, though it sounds simple, can change everything. One of the most fascinating reasons we get stuck in overthinking is that, on some level, it feels productive. The brain associates thinking with problem solving. And so, even when we're spinning in circles, analyzing the same thought from 50 angles, it gives us the illusion that we're doing something useful. It feels like progress. But in reality, overthinking is often just motion without movement. This psychological trap is what experts call the illusion of control. The more we think, the more we feel like we're gaining clarity or preparing ourselves. But what's really happening is emotional avoidance. Instead of acting, deciding, or feeling something difficult, we stay in our minds, looping thoughts, analyzing details, predicting reactions. Why? Because staying in our heads feels safer than stepping into the discomfort of the unknown. Let's take an example. Suppose you have to make a decision. Maybe it's whether to leave a job, end a relationship, or take a risk. Your brain starts running simulations. What if I regret it? What if it doesn't work out? What if people judge me? So you overthink. Convinced that by thinking enough, you'll find a perfect answer. But perfection never arrives. And so you keep thinking, not realizing that your brain has confused thinking with action and analysis with clarity. This illusion is especially strong in people who fear making mistakes. For them, overthinking becomes a shield. If I think enough, they reason, I can avoid failure, pain, or embarrassment. But ironically, it's the overthinking that often causes those very things. Decisions are delayed, opportunities are missed, peace is sacrificed, and the mind stays trapped in a cycle of endless preparation for a moment that never comes. Another layer to this illusion is emotional reassurance. When we feel uncertain, anxious, or afraid, thinking becomes a form of self-soothing. We tell ourselves, I just need to figure out, or if I can understand this better, I'll feel better. But often, it doesn't work that way, because overthinking doesn't lead to peace. It leads to more thinking, and more thinking leads to more emotional discomfort, not less. It becomes a self-perpetuating loop, where we think in order to feel okay, but the thinking makes us feel worse, so we think even more. This is why it's so important to begin separating thinking from problem solving. Not every thought is helpful. Not every analysis is progress. And not every worry is a sign that something's wrong. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is pause, acknowledge your discomfort, and ask yourself, am I actually solving something right now, or am I just trying to feel safe? The key is to notice when your thoughts are just dressed up fears. Are you imagining worst-case scenarios without any new information? Are you trying to predict someone else's feelings or reactions? Are you replaying past events, hoping to rewrite the outcome in your head? These are signs that you're not solving, you're spiraling. One of the most effective tools against the illusion of productive overthinking is intentional action. Even small steps can disrupt the loop. Make the call, write the message, choose a direction. Not because you're certain it's the right choice, but because certainty is not the goal. Movement is. Growth doesn't come from perfect thoughts. It comes from imperfect action and the willingness to face uncertainty. It's also worth remembering that clarity often comes after action, not before it. You don't always get to feel confident before you decide. Sometimes the confidence shows up after you commit. The brain wants guarantees, but life rarely gives them. And the longer you stay trapped in your thoughts waiting for the perfect plan, the more disconnected you become from your instincts, your courage, and your present moment. So the next time you find yourself deep in overthinking, stop and ask, what am I trying to control here? What emotion am I avoiding? And what small step can I take instead of thinking more? Because clarity doesn't live in your mind. It lives in the doing. And when you truly understand that, the illusion starts to break. Overthinking loses its grip, and your mind finally finds space to rest. So, after everything we've explored today, from the psychological roots to the neurological patterns, from emotional loops to the illusion of productivity, one truth stands out. Overthinking is not a flaw in your character. It's a feature of how your brain has evolved to protect you. But just because it's common doesn't mean it has to control you. The human brain is one of the most powerful tools on Earth. But even the most powerful tools need direction. If we don't guide our thoughts, they'll guide us, often into anxiety, fear, and indecision. The good news is, awareness is the first and most important step. When you understand why your brain overthinks, you start gaining the power to choose a different response. It's not about silencing your thoughts overnight. It's about recognizing when you've left the realm of problem solving and entered the spiral of self-sabotage. It's about gently bringing your mind back to the present, back to action, back to peace. Every time you notice yourself lost in thought, pause, breathe, ask yourself, is this helpful? Is this solving anything? Or am I just seeking control over the uncontrollable? In that pause, in that moment of mindfulness, you're not just breaking the cycle. You're rewiring your brain for calm, clarity, and resilience. Remember this. You are not your thoughts. You are the awareness behind them. And that awareness is where your power lives. Thank you for listening. And if this resonated with you, don't forget to share it with someone who might be silently struggling with their own mind. Sometimes one insight is all it takes to start changing the narrative.